So good morning and welcome to the Amaero International Investor Webinar. My name is Jane Morgan, the Investor and Media Relations Manager for Amaero, and today I'm joined by our Executive Chairman and CEO, Hank Holland, as well as Lieutenant General HR McMaster, who is a Special Advisor to Chairman and CEO. So today's webinar will be a conversation with HR McMasters, followed by a Q&A session. So to ask a question throughout today's webinar, please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. But Hank, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jane, very much. It's absolutely my privilege to introduce Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. H.R. is a friend, a trusted advisor, a soldier, a historian, and a statesman. As announced earlier this year, H.R. has joined Amaero as Special Advisor to Chairman and CEO. In his role, we regularly discuss strategic and commercial matters, and he's advising Amaero pertaining to our engagement with the U.S. government, Department of Defense, defense prime contractors, and the broader defense industrial base ecosystem. HR retired from the military in June 2018 after serving as National Security Advisor to President Trump. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy in 1984 and served as a commissioned officer for 34 years. From 2014 to 2017, McMaster was tasked with designing the future Army as the Director of Army Capabilities Integration Center and the Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Center. In February 1991, with coalition forces nearing victory in the Gulf War, then Army Captain H.R. McMaster led the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in the largest tank battle since World War II, the Battle of 73 Easting. With coalition forces severely outnumbered, H.R. led a bold flanking maneuver. The battle strategy and the valor of our soldiers led to a decisive victory with the destruction of 28 tanks, 20 personnel carriers, and 30 trucks. The coalition forces had 0 losses. H.R. McMaster was awarded the Silver Star for his leadership and valor. H.R., thank you for your service to our country and for your leadership. The thrust of our discussion today will focus on the U.S.'s initiative to reshore critical industrial base capabilities, including defense production and supply chain. That said, given the tumultuous times and the anniversary of Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel, I'm sure that our listeners would appreciate hearing your perspective. While serving as President Trump's national security advisor, you led a shift in foreign policy. You prepared and presented national security policy options to the president, and you were directly engaged with President Putin, President Xi, and the leadership in Iran. As it relates to Iran, you were in the room when President Trump made the decision to pull out of JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear agreement. Can you share your observations and insights on the Iranian offensive against Israel and its proxy war?
Yeah, hey, Hank, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you and the whole Amaero team. You know, I'm a huge believer in the mission, and your company is so critical to really reestablishing our defense industrial base capabilities after we allowed it to atrophy for way too long. And I know we'll talk more about that. But on Iran, you know, actually President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA just after I left as National Security Advisor, but we had set conditions for him to do that because we recognized that that deal really forgot to take into consideration 2 aspects of the relationship, if you can call that, with Iran, or really Iran's aggression against the United States. You know, they call it the Great Satan. Israel, who they call the cancerous boil, and its Arab neighbors, and that is the ideology that drives and constrains Iranian leadership and their real determination to export the revolution and to establish hegemonic influence in the Middle East. First, by pushing the United States out of the region and keeping the Arab world perpetually enmeshed in conflict, and to weaken its Arab neighbors, so that it can surround and destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. I mean, that's really what they want to do. And I think a lot of times we neglect that ideology that drives that theocratic dictatorship. And then also we've neglected kind of just the record, you know, of the 4-decade-plus long proxy wars that Iran has been waging, you know, against the United States, against Israel and its Arab neighbors, and doing so in a way that again, keeps the Arab world perpetually weak by growing these militias and terrorist organizations that lay outside of a government's control, that can be turned against that government if that government acts against their interests. and supporting these terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, which was its really first big proxy and its biggest and was its most capable one, as well as then supporting Hamas, obviously, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Hashtag-Shabi militias are called in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and this proxy army of about 40,000 strong in Syria that has enabled the serial episodes of mass homicide in a war that has killed, wounded, or displaced half the Syrian population. And so I think, Hank, as we remember, this heinous assault on Israel, we have to also remember that this fits in to a 4-decade plus long proxy war. We have to also remember, Hank, that if we adjusted for population, that the losses that Israel suffered would be the equivalent of over 50,000 killed in the United States. And think about what we had to do after 9/11, which is to pursue the jihadist terrorists who had committed, the largest mass murder terrorist attack in history. And so I just think that what we have to recognize is that it's okay. I mean, I think to pressure Israel to limit the death of innocent civilians, but also recognize that they have no option but to destroy Hamas and Hezbollah. I think the big lesson that they've learned from October 7th is that you can't have a terrorist organization on your border with those kind of capabilities. And of course, both those terrorist organizations have committed themselves to destroying Israel. And so what confounds me, Hank, is how people can say, well, they need a ceasefire, they need to stop, but then we need to get back on a path to a two-state solution. Well, Hamas saying, hey, we want to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews. That doesn't sound like they're signing up for a two-state solution to me. So I think we have to recognize that the destruction of these enemies, of really all civilized people, is a precondition to being able to envision an enduring peace between Israel, the Palestinians, Israel, and its neighbors.
Well, sadly, it makes it very difficult to understand how a two-state solution could work, given the foundational precept of destroying Israel as we know it, right? And I think for all of us in the Western world, certainly all of us that are Christian or we're Jewish, we understand the paramount importance of our ally in Israel. And I do think it's very difficult when we, the U.S., as a strong ally, talk about this moral equivalency. Clearly, we all want to limit damage to civilian populations, but it's very difficult to think of it as a moral equivalency when the attack a year ago was explicitly on a civilian population, right? Very, very difficult. Moving on, and in addition to Iran, HR, you had direct engagement with China, you had direct engagement with Russia. I grew up in high school, getting on the desk, and we would all have the nuclear war test, if you will, and the single axis of evil. It seems today, though, right, we no longer have a single axis of evil, right? We have hostility and threats emanating from emerging economic and military superpower in China, the vestiges of a decaying superpower in Russia, and the fervor of jihadist power in Iran, as we're talking about. From a national security perspective, in the context of the post-World War II era, what is your assessment and just how dangerous are these times?
Yeah, Hank, I think this is the new normal, right? I mean, I think a lot of people are hoping that this is a transitory period and we'll get back to normal as defined as what we had hoped for a post-Cold War world. Well, I think after the Cold War, we kind of took a holiday from history, right? We assumed that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies and our free market economic systems over authoritarian systems or mercantilist statist economic models like that of China. We had thought also, the great power competition was a relic of the past. Remember, there was a hope, right, that we would form kind of a condominium of nations globally that would work together on global issues, mainly through international organizations. And then also, I think we had a related assumption that our prowess, our technological, economic, our military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future. I mean, I don't know if any of your viewers, investors remember this term of no peer competitor, right? That we would achieve, full spectrum dominance. Really, the language about defense in this period was quite hubristic, right? And it didn't acknowledge, I think, the authorship over the future that others have. And so I think we've returned to a situation where geopolitics, geostrategic competition is at the forefront of international relations. It's a competition, and sadly, Hank, as you know all too well, as Amaero is trying to fill this this hole in our industrial capabilities and capacity, that we vacated critical arenas of competition and left them to our enemies and adversaries, and the belief that that China would change, right? China, having been welcomed into the international economic order, would play by the rules, and as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. That didn't work out. That Russia, having after the breakup of the Soviet Union, would realize that, hey, its future is with Europe, and a close relationship with Europe. Well, Vladimir Putin had different ideas, right? And he has aspirations that go far beyond anything that's in reaction to what we do. He really, really does want to reestablish the Russian Empire. Iran, as I mentioned, is fighting this 4-decade-plus long proxy war in an effort to kind of export the revolution, establish hegemonic power in the Middle East, isolate Israel, and encircle Israel in what they call a ring of fire strategy. And of course, we have got North Korea, who doesn't want to be left out. The only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world with nuclear weapons, committed, I believe, to reunify the peninsula under the so-called, what they call the red banner, right? So what you're pointing out, and I think this is really important, is that these four members, of an axis of aggressors, I would call them, are working together in a very tangible way, in an unprecedented way, really. And we see that with material support, Shahed drones, short-range missiles from Iran to Russia. What are they getting in return? They're getting technical assistance for their missile programs, and I believe probably for their nuclear programs as well. I saw a report last couple of days. I didn't really verify this, but it was a credible think tank, said that 60% of the artillery that Russia's firing to kill Ukrainians is North Korean. What are they getting in return? And we know that China, because more and more evidence is mounting, it's just undeniable now. I mean, I think we all should have known this from the beginning. But China is providing the critical assistance to Russia so they can feed Putin's ATM to finance the war, but also critical material assistance through the electronics and hardware necessary to sustain this onslaught against the Ukrainians. So we have to come to grips with this. And I think what we've seen are some big lessons I'm sure we'll talk about associated with the degree to which our industrial base has atrophied and the degree to which we've allowed, hostile regimes to have coercive power over our economy by allowing our supply chains to have single points of failure that are controlled, by these hostile authoritarian regimes.
It's a remarkable thing we've done. I was reading today, I just got from the American Enterprise Institute, some satellite images showing the massive scale and sheer speed at which China is rapidly building their shipyards. And it's got some data. China can now build more ships in 1 month than the U.S. has a capability to build in a year. It goes on to say China's shipbuilding workforce is nearly 5 times the size of the United States and supports more than 7,000 vessels. Meanwhile, our shipyards support 200 ships. It's just remarkable when you see the scale, right, and the pace of which they're moving. So turning to the industrial base and turning to China, and again, reflecting on your direct engagement with President Xi and your counterparts, if we go back in history, I think one of the most proud moments of our country was the remarkable industrial efforts we had in the lead up to World War II. Right, in 1939, for those that might not know on the call, the United States was the 27th largest manufacturing country in the world. Very much a second, some would argue a third-tier manufacturing country. By 1944, of course, we were producing 1 bomber an hour and led, right, the entire world, right, as far as global economic output. The great period of the arsenal of democracy, and you mentioned a moment ago how we've hollowed out. How did we get here? How did we go from the technological and manufacturing global supremacy to hollowing out this entire capability in a matter of decades?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of reasons for it, but it really begins in the 1990s, especially with China's being granted most favored nations status, and the belief that unchecked globalization was the greatest way toward prosperity. And of course, there were a lot who prospered, in this period of time, but there were a lot that were left behind, and especially in American manufacturing. That pace accelerated, Hank, in 2001 with China's entry into the World Trade Organization. And China's continuation of its mercantilist and statist policies in a way that placed us at a profound disadvantage. A lot of this was underwritten, sadly, with U.S. capital by those who saw the opportunity to turn quick and huge profits associated with invigorating Chinese manufacturing based on the competitiveness of cheap labor there and the willingness of the government to allow and then later to subsidize the development of massive manufacturing infrastructure, really concentrated in an artificial way from a global perspective on the southeastern coast of China. And in this period of time, we continued to act, like China's system was compatible with ours. And it gave them a tremendous advantage in really attacking us from an economic perspective with what I would call economic aggression. This includes massive cyber espionage and other forms of espionage through insider threats and the theft of intellectual property and know-how. It also involves, obviously, as anybody who's in your industry, around your industry, gets this, understands this, the forced transfer of intellectual property and technology based on the joint venture law and other means of extracting that information. As soon as China was able to obtain that intellectual property and that technology and that know-how, they would pick then the Chinese winner. They would shut U.S. manufacturers, U.S. companies out of the Chinese market. And then the next form of economic aggression were big subsidies, right? Subsidies in the form of free rent, but also just direct subsidies, right? Huawei, just pick one example in terms of fifth generation communications hardware. Steals Cisco's and others' intellectual property, subsidizes that business to what we know of. All we know of is $60 billion. And then after they shut you down in their domestic market, what they do is they'll produce those goods at artificially low prices, dump them on the international market, and run you out of business. And now people still act like they're surprised about this, right? I mean, look at what's happening in the automobile sector these days. I mean, Volkswagen, how did they not know what was going to happen to them? It happened to battery manufacturers. It happened to wind turbine manufacturers, solar panel manufacturers. So, this overcapacity associated with the subsidization, the overproduction, the dumping, right? This is what accelerated the atrophy of our industrial base and placed us in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. And we had a number of wake-up calls, Hank, but we just didn't pay enough attention. And I don't think we still have the urgency, that we need to address this problem. I'm talking obviously about, the obvious fragility of supply chains during COVID, for example, and the use of those supply chains for coercive purposes by, the Chinese Communist Party. How about, a case in point of how unwise it is to give a hostile authoritarian power coercive power over your economy. Look at the example of Germany and their dependence on cheap natural gas from Russia, for example. Look at kind of the fallacies associated with the energy transition as a leap to renewables. Well, a leap to renewables is a leap off a cliff, and in Germany's case, it was a leap into the arms of Vladimir Putin, and so, energy security, supply chain resilience, all is so important. And of course, the next big wake-up call was the Ukraine war and the degree to which we struggled and are still struggling to manufacture the weapons and munitions at scale. And now look at this recent, this recent regulation by the Chinese Communist Party that critical minerals and materials for export require waivers, from the CCP.
Super abrasive.
That's a shot across our bow, Hank.
Yep.
And I think we're teed up right now for an effort by the CCP to try to crater our economy. I think they're going to try to do it. I mean, they're going to hurt their economy too if they do it. But I think it's like the fable of the scorpion and the frog, with China in the role of the scorpion. They're not going to be able to help themselves. So we're in a race, Hank, but we're not sprinting yet. Amaero's sprinting, with the capital that that you've committed and your investors have committed, and I really just am so grateful for that. But we need, everybody, public and across the public and private sector, to recognize that this is a long competition. But if we don't sprint right now, we may never get back in the competition.
HR, it seems to me one of the foundational differences from the great period of the arsenal of democracy to now is you go back to the period of arsenal democracy. You had Henry Kaisers, you had all of these amazing entrepreneurs that led these companies, that led this industrial effort. Coming out of World War II, we had over 50 defense prime contractors. Today we have 5, none of which are entrepreneurial companies, all of which are very large industrial complex companies. And on one hand, as a small company, I think that's our opportunity. Candidly, it's also our challenge, right? Yeah. This incumbency, if you will, right? This legacy from a competitive standpoint that also creates a rather anti-competitive environment given these incumbent participants. And you see the same thing in the DoD. I know even in your case, right? And one of your last roles in the Army was reinventing the future Army. And you and I have talked about even that within the Pentagon, those that were threatened or challenged, if you will, the ceded powers, even how hard something such as that was. And as a small business, we've got our own challenges navigating that, as you know.
Absolutely. And, I think the environment's changing though, Hank. I really do, and what we need to see companies like yours succeed, right? And to send the signal out that, we can mobilize, enterprises to fill the gaps, and in this case, our dependence on critical materials, on single points of failure controlled by our adversaries. We've got to break that. And so I think that there's a recognition of the problem, but the urgency doesn't really match the recognition yet. There are a lot of
HR. It's interesting. You saw something that for whatever reason others hadn't, and in the U.S., our venture capital or emerging capital is largely funded, right, by a certain pool of private capital, venture capital, different than Australia as an example. And yet heretofore, venture capital has not wanted to support defense. It hasn't wanted to support very long life contracts, ESG issues, whatever the issues might be. And part of what you saw was the need for something such as DIU, the need for something such as Office of Strategic Capital, that is finding a way to incentivize the private sector, private capital, and particularly small business, right, to work more closely with the Department of Defense and supporting our national security efforts. What did you see and what were the challenges that you were trying to overcome?
Well, Hank, you already alluded to it. I mean, the consolidation in the defense industry, might have seemed appropriate in the early 1990s, but man, it turns out to have been a really bad idea. And so what we need is, we need our best minds, our best engineers, our most agile companies working on the biggest defense problems that we have. And they have to be able to see a path forward, and to do that, with some of the initial grants and investments by the government, like the Defense Innovation Unit. Now, the government's got skin in the game. They really want to see this company succeed. But then, you hit that valley of death, right? That gap where for you to really hit your revenue stream with a program of record, with the government procuring at scale, it takes too long sometimes. And so, to get there, you need patient investment. We're starting to see that now with, certain companies. Anduril's an example of this. There are others, who've made it across the valley of death. And now they have procurement contracts, and you have like a new defense prime for the first time, since the 1990s. You're starting to see it more with multinational cooperation among allies and partners, is why I think it's awesome. With your Australian roots, this is a free world problem. We're not going to solve this together. I think you mentioned shipbuilding, the degree to which the U.S. government is now looking to South Korea to be part of that problem. We've got to improve our shipbuilding base here in the United States, but heck, we also need to work together from a multinational, international perspective. And then, I think, Hank, there's a recognition now that because of China's weaponization of its mercantilist status model against us, government has to play a role with the tools of economic statecraft. So you got to create space for some of these industries. And that's going to take, some trade enforcement mechanisms that are oriented on unfair economic practices like overcapacity and overproduction and dumping and subsidies, right? I think you're going to see that no matter what administration comes in. I mean, I know you're definitely going to see it in Trump administration, that and these are tariffs, right? And other trade enforcement mechanisms, that will, to create that space is necessary. But, what I love about your company, Hank, is, we want to catch up, right, back in the areas that we kind of lost our competitive advantage, but also let's just leap ahead, right? So if we can, employ, advanced manufacturing techniques, we take anybody's, we take away a lot of the advantages of cheap labor, for example, because we have new means of production, and then also, ways of producing, new materials, or materials in a different way, that allow us to make our supply chains more resilient, rather than, trying to find like the next lithium mine. Let's find other materials. Let's find other ways of mineral separation and refinement, and so I just think that requires all hands on deck. We can't rely just on the biggest companies. It's got to be companies like yours and others who get in the game, who anticipate, like you did, the demand. And then, as you alluded to, you need patient capital for this, right? Because you can't, we got into the mode of, really getting some great returns. A lot of venture firms did, obviously, on software, right? But now I think we're recognizing, I mean, if you're preparing for war, and of course you want to prepare for war so you can prevent war, you can't hit anybody over the head with software, you still need
Amaero, and I talked about this quite a bit this summer. Amaero made two very intentional decisions. One of which is we're going to run very hard, take bold strategic action, and position us in a way that larger companies could not act that decisively, could not act that boldly. On the other hand, what most small companies, the challenge they have, and you alluded to it, is they then wait for federal funding. And we made the decision, we can't. We've got to have a first mover advantage. And we've got to create a defensive moat around our business. And thus we decided to fund this business ourselves to a point. I'm highly confident, I think that you would agree, given the nature of our strategy and where we sit, we've certainly had indications of federal support. I suspect that we will be beneficiaries of federal funding over time. And it certainly is right down the middle of the strategies and the positions that are in place for a national priority. At the very same time, most companies wait for that, right? And at the end of the day, we're a government, we're a bureaucracy. And the decision that we've made was to invest boldly to go forward. I think that's created an interesting position where we sit at today, from which we can catapult, right? From which we can then pursue these other activities. A question for you. You mentioned the potential second Trump administration. Those in Australia don't all follow the U.S. election as closely as we do. Share your thoughts. A Harris administration, a Trump administration. In each of those, as it relates to posturing our national security and as it relates to supporting the rebuilding, if you will, of this industrial base we're talking about, what would you expect from two different administrations?
Yeah. Okay. So I think you would see a more aggressive approach with the tools of economic statecraft, including tariffs, including export controls, including inbound and outbound investment screening. For example, but I think there would be.
I assume you're alluding to a Trump administration. You would expect
to a Trump administration, right? But I think that actually there wouldn't be a huge amount of difference between either administration on those tools, because there's one of the things I'm proud of, Hank, is the degree to which our team worked together in the Trump administration to really change our perspective on the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and the weaponization of its economy against us, and I think that is one of the biggest elements of continuity, between the Trump and the Biden administrations. What I'm concerned about, for maybe a Harris administration, is I think we require some vast investments in defense right now because of the coalescing of this axis of aggressors, the massive Chinese military buildup, and a bow wave of deferred defense modernization that we're encountering, as well as the need for the defense budget to be a big part of reinvigorating our defense industrial base, through, I think, certain grants and investments, but really just through multi-year contracting to send the right demand signals to industry so that they make the investments in the capital and the human capital that's necessary to increase production and scale and increase the tempo of production for weapons and munitions. So, I think that both both political parties get it now. I think There's a great deal, as you can see in the recent review of defense. This is the recent Senate report that's pretty darn compelling. I think that we have a lot of work to do, and we have to do it across the public and private sectors. I mean, one of the biggest I think revelations here is that where a lot of your defense advantages used to come from were government funded, big, classified research and development programs. Now, the research and development that happens, for technologies that are relevant to defense in the private sector, those budgets dwarf, the Department of Defense or the government budgets. So we really need all hands on deck on this, to be able to restore our competitive advantages, and to preserve peace through strength, and I think that's really what's concerning me more than anything right now, Hank, is there's a perception of weakness. I think our enemies perceive weakness in us, and that's what's
invites conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say, and I want to open this up to others to ask questions and have a chance to dialogue with you as well. The last comment I would make is, from a positive standpoint, HR, you are so well respected on Capitol Hill by both parties. And I think there's very few issues in our country today where you get bipartisan support, right? We are so polarized in so many ways across so many issues. And one positive I take away on Capitol Hill in particular, there is bipartisan support. There is strong, unifying support. And you've seen that both in appropriation strategy as well as in dialogue in general to elevate the conversation around national defense. And I think it's one of the very few things in the country we do, in fact, have bipartisan support for.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, this shouldn't be a partisan issue, right? And as we were effecting this major shift in policy, and as we rolled out the national security strategy in December of 2017, where a lot of these priorities are outlined, and I think that stood the test of time, and these critical actions, in terms of invigorating our industrial base and revitalizing our national security innovation base, a term that we coined in that strategy. We brought in, people from both sides of the aisle. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. Yeah,
Jane, one more point. I'm going to turn over to you to narrate questions. We're talking a lot about how we've hollowed out the industrial base capability side, but in so doing, we've hollowed out these great manufacturing jobs. And, I sit today in Tennessee, and you and I know the great states of Tennessee and North Carolina and Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, some of the great states in this country. It's really where the manufacturing renaissance is happening. It's not happening in New York. It's not happening in California. It's happening in the Southeast. It's happening in these legacy states, if you will. And these are great jobs, right? Really great jobs that we shipped overseas. And there too, we've got strong bipartisan support, whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration. I think there will be strong support to bring back these manufacturing jobs. It's one of the exciting areas that Amaero sits.
Yeah, Hank, I mean, this is one of the things I think you mentioned microprocessors, computer chips earlier. This idea that you can separate design from manufacturing and then something good's going to happen from that. Really? I mean, I think, I think that applies across the board. When I look at my iPhone, designed in California. Okay, but where is it made? That might be an issue, so I think there's a big recognition of this cuts across both political parties. And I'm really, psyched that Amaero's on the front line, really leading the way in a lot of ways, to address this need to reinvigorate our industrial base.
Well, the last comment, and then Jane, again, be prepared if you would to initiate questions. For those on the call, and again, I've had the privilege of knowing HR for some time. HR, since you've transitioned to the private sector, you've had a lot of other opportunities. And obviously, you've got a very busy schedule with your fellowship at the Hoover Institution and the continued roles you've had. To my knowledge, you've only taken on 2 private sector roles, Amaero and one other company. What was it about Amaero specifically? And obviously, you're passionate about our mission, but specifically, why did you commit to Amaero, and why are you so passionate about what we're doing?
Well, maybe predictably, Hank, as a washed up general, as I was transitioning to civilian life, for my only the 3rd job I had in my life, because I went into the Army at age 17 at West Point, was that, that I wanted to contribute to to a more full understanding of the most significant challenges and opportunities we faced from a security perspective and a defense perspective, and then help any company or anyone who's trying to overcome those challenges and help secure a peaceful and prosperous future for future generations. And so I always try to evaluate any kind of opportunity based on that, whether it and of course Amaero fits squarely into that mission statement. And of course, I want to kind of over deliver for you and the company. And I felt like what I'm working on from an academic perspective, writing the book Battlegrounds in particular, and that last chapter on arenas of competition, I felt like, hey, here's a company that is re-entering that arena of competition, and I'm just excited to help in any way I can.
Great. Thanks again, HR. Jane, I'll turn it over to you to initiate questions, please.
Wonderful. And gentlemen, thank you both for your insights throughout this discussion. Look, I know there's going to be several attendees who would like to take this opportunity to ask both Hank and HR further questions. So please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. Let me kick off. So the first question here is from Tom. Hank, I might actually pass to you for this one. So it's looking increasingly likely that we a Trump presidency with the Republican House and Senate. In that environment, how do you see the Inflation Reduction Act changing, and what potential impacts can you see for Amaero?
Yeah, well, I think some of the big things that will change are the mandates associated with an immediate transition to renewable sources of energy, and in particular electrification of automobiles. And I think the reason why that will change is probably a good reason, based on the recognition that could create vulnerabilities associated with reliance, again, on supply chains controlled by China. We would, in some ways, trade the kind of dependence we had on fossil fuels on the Middle East in the 70s, for a new form of energy dependence on China. And as we know, if the real objective is, energy security and the effort to reduce man-made carbon emissions, electric cars, or components of electric cars, the batteries and so forth, and magnets and everything else, if they're manufactured in China with electricity that's generated from coal-fired plants, I mean, we're better off, with our internal combustion engines, So I think that there'll be a real emphasis on that, on shift away from that and doing what's maybe more sensible. You'll see big changes, I think, in any kind of restrictions on fossil fuel, exploration. But also export, and especially natural gas and LNG export, under the belief that this too is good if you want to get the world off coal, and then also maybe generate revenues that could be used to fund a green transition. I think you'll see an emphasis on nuclear fission and EM squared reactors, for example. So I think more emphasis on energy security, but I think in the areas of kind of supply chain resilience, you'll see sort of a renewed emphasis, and I would say probably a big emphasis in the Trump administration on deregulation and permitting reform. This would be for mining, mineral separation, refinement, and so forth.
HR, I would add to that you just wrote a book, The War Within, talking about your time in the Trump administration, and I loved reading the book, and from a context standpoint, talking about the Trump policy. And you can't talk about policy in isolation. And you talked about it so well in the context of the preceding 8 years under Obama and the 4 years that followed under Biden, right? And how you contrasted that policy. And by and large, you agreed with that America First, that more nationalistic policy, if you will. At the very same time, you certainly didn't feel Trump was a perfect person, right? As an individual. And I think that the one thing that there's a question, by the way, that I'll read here, and Jane, I'm letting you get the rest of these, but I want to make a point with it. Regarding policies of Trump and Harris, Trump, Vance have both declared intention to surrender. I'm reading this. This is not my view necessarily. To surrender to Putin on day one. Harris has been equally explicit in declaring support for Ukraine. Comment on that. Comment on the Ukraine situation, but also expand upon. You made an earlier point. That weakness, if you will, has invited this conflict, and say what you want about Trump. Yeah. Trump, a little bit like Reagan, in that Reagan feared people feared Reagan because he was so unpredictable, such a wild cowboy, if you will, of what he might do. I think Trump had some of that same effect on foreign leaders.
Yeah, I think he did, certainly initially. And Trump's disruptive. There was a lot that needed to be disruptive. But, of course, he's so disruptive that he disrupts himself sometimes, based on what he says and what he does. And I think this was the case with, with Putin as well. Like, he had that cloud of, Russiagate, these unfounded allegations of collusion and so forth. And that, I think, reinforced, his idea that he can get like a big deal with Vladimir Putin. And what I write about in the book is that, hey, he wasn't the first president to labor under that delusion, right? Remember, George W. Bush looked into Putin's soul and thought that he would have a kind of an entente with Putin. President Obama, even after the invasion of Georgia, there were some really clear indicators. He had the reset policy, with Putin, and Trump likes nothing more than a big deal, and I think some of this rhetoric about ended the war in 24 hours. I mean, I don't think anybody believes that, but what he hopes to do is set conditions with these statements for some kind of a big deal. What I think maybe he doesn't still fully understand is that, hey, Putin has aspirations. Putin has goals in mind that go far beyond anything that's in reaction to what Donald Trump does or promises to him. And really what provokes Putin, is this kind of perception of weakness, not sustaining support for Ukraine. This is my biggest concern, really, about a Trump administration. But I'll tell you what I think will happen, because there are so many in the Republican Party who support, providing Ukraine with the assistance they need to defend themselves against this unjustified onslaught against them. Is that I could see a long-term loan, that would sustain our support for Ukraine under the recognition. I mean, this is one of the things, the money that we're spending to support Ukraine, we're spending it mostly in the United States, and
mostly U.S. jobs and U.S. goods.
Right. And has really been a big part of, at least making some initial progress at expanding our defense industrial base. Right. I mean, I wish Zelensky had, visited a factory in a swing state, Pennsylvania, but that factory in Scranton is an example of that. I wish he'd just gone to Texas or something and been, kind of politically neutral, or Tennessee for that matter, Hank. So I think, anyway, yeah, I worried about it.
So speak openly. Given Trump's confrontational nature, and we saw this with our allies with NATO funding and so forth. By the way, of my own view, some issues that need to be raised, some issues of parity, right, that need to be raised.
Yeah.
Talk about AUKUS, if you would, and talk about AUKUS under a Harris administration, a Trump administration, and the plausibility of AUKUS being revisited. And for now, at least, Australia has set somewhat on a pacifist fence, particularly as it relates to Taiwan. And to what extent, if that's true, if you feel that's true, to what extent might there be a decision point to make, right, as far as the willingness to step in a conflict that might involve Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think, Australia doesn't need a lesson from me on, the dangers of the CCP, right? Especially, after Australia, had the temerity to suggest, hey, maybe we ought to look into the origins of COVID-19, and then was on the receiving end of a massive coercive economic campaign against them by the CCP. And then, this and the Garneau study in terms of the subversion by the CCP, which was fantastic. And I think Australia led the way in a lot of ways.
Australia was 10 years ahead of us in many ways, right? Pointing out the issues of China well ahead of the U.S.
Absolutely. And also, recognizing, the degree to which it would damage, Australian national security for China to own the ocean, as they're claiming in the South China Sea, right? And so Australia's been in a lot of ways leading in this area. And, U.S. allies, a lot of times, they have this kind of schizophrenic nature, right, between concerns of either entanglement, in conflicts that maybe aren't in their interest, or abandonment, that tends to kind of swing. I think Australia's been really steady on this, and I think under both administrations, AUKUS would expand. Maybe it will become JAUKUS with Japan. I think that would be a good idea. And then I think everybody's focused on the nuclear submarine program, but the other tiers of this agreement I think are extremely important, especially in the area of science and technology development, and I think in technologies in particular that will reduce our vulnerability to Chinese economic coercion, right, and control of supply chains. So I think, you know, an area of AUKUS that really is going to expand. It's already starting to. The Biden administration has been trying to invigorate the second, third areas of the agreement. I think that's going to continue in both administrations.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm jumping around a little bit here. There's quite a few questions coming through. So next one here is again from Tom, but how likely is the US federal government to aid individual companies that are addressing this critical capability deficiencies? And is there an opportunity here for Amaero?
Yeah, I think it's very likely. You know, that money is already, appropriated, right? And the government is trying to figure out in its slow, cautious, risk-averse way right now about how to spend some of that money. I know, Hank, you have more experts in the company than I do, but I think it's really important for Amaero and other companies to make the case, right, to make sure that they know the capabilities Amaero is providing. That's something that we're going to do here pretty soon during a visit to Washington. And hey, I think that Shane, there's a huge recognition of this right now, and I think that that's only going to grow, and the urgency is going to grow too, because Xi Jinping can't help himself, right? I mean, he says, "Hey, China's open for business," and then he cracks down on any of the companies that are trying to provide any transparency into Chinese companies, right? He wants to recover from COVID, but he has a zero COVID policy, and he cracks down on the tech sector, which is one of the big engines of growth. And then, so I mean, I'm telling you, I think that what we're going to see are acts of economic aggression that are, I hope, maybe more mild, but like kind of the equivalent of the Sputnik, realization that, hey, we've gotten way far behind. Some people think it's going to take a more severe crisis for us to wake up, but I don't think so. I think more and more people recognize the threat and recognize what needs to happen in terms of investments in the U.S. industrial base.
I would add that I totally agree. HR and I will be in Washington, D.C. together next week. I would say that on the federal side, there's really three different areas. And in each of these, the most important thing Amaero can do is how do we advance U.S. national security policy, period, right? That's the most important thing we do. How are we part of the solution? How do we advance these initiatives that help our country and help our allies? If we do that, I'm highly confident there will be support that naturally follows that. I think that support tends to be in three flavors. I think you've got congressionally appropriated support. I think you've got U.S. grants that are in the form of non-dilutive equity, if you will, to stand up incremental capabilities. And then likewise, and HR has been involved in this, we now have agencies such as Office of Strategic Capital, the Undersecretary of Defense, that are providing debt to assist with these capabilities. One of the capabilities that I would point out that is so well suited for Amaero, and this became more evident after Ukraine, is the immense shortage we have in this country for large castings and large forgings, excuse me. And so we talk a lot about the powder side of our business, but likewise, the powder metallurgy HIP side of our business, where we're manufacturing very, very large parts. Think about submarine industrial base as an example, that otherwise, to the extent these parts will be forged, it's a 2-year wait. We don't have 2 years. We've got military assets parked, whether they're parked in dry harbor or they're parked on a runway, and they cannot fly because we don't have spare parts. And this is an example of kind of a now opportunity for Amaero versus some of these longer term opportunities where we're going through research, development, demonstration phase to eventually get into production.
Thank you, gentlemen. There's quite a few questions just on that. Just further to that, I think one of the questions here from Marcus, and this is for you, HR. So what involvement, if any, can you provide both access to and expediting government funding for Amaero's projects?
Yeah. So, for me personally, you mean what I can do? I think it's just to make the case, right? And of course, I'm more comfortable doing that on the Hill. I don't want to, pitch people in the Department of Defense and that sort of thing. But I think also helping Hank and Amaero put together that argument. I mean, not that he needs any help or the team needs any help. I think this is one of these areas where you've had a company who has seen, the need. They were like ahead, I think, of the really dramatic realization in government, and government's looking around for solutions, and hey, Amaero has a solution that's like here right now and very compelling. So I think in many ways, it's kind of obvious to people within the government, But what I can help do is kind of provide that context of of how Amaero's capabilities, Amaero's capacity addresses really kind of a vital threat to our security.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another one that's come through. So what's the right approach for Australian companies, excuse me, rather, seeking to involve themselves in the US defense procurement chain?
Yeah. Well, there are a number of different paths, and one is to seek U.S. partners, but the other is to develop a U.S. based capability as well, and or an entity, and then but the critical thing to take a look at, I think, is in the near term, what are sort of what are the requests for proposal that are out there that you can fulfill, but in the longer term, what you want to look at are the service-based requirements and the joint requirements, right? What are the combatant commands saying that they need? What are the services saying that they need? And, one of the struggles I had when I was developing the future Army or designing the future Army was trying to communicate that much more clearly than we had in the past, right? By really just, having 20 first order problem statements, that we could ask for help from industry, U.S. industry, but industry from allied and strategic partner countries, and so I think that that's still kind of missing in the Department of Defense. But based on if you especially have a commercial market already, right, and you're looking for a defense application of your product, or then look at those kind of requirements as what the military is thinking of in the longer term, beyond the 5 years that are budgeted, in the POM, it's called, the Program Objective Memorandum period. And I think that can also help you communicate, hey, how your company's part of the solution. And then you can look for partners, obviously, too.
HR, I think it's a great point. I think if you think about our allies that are best positioned, right? Australian as an English-speaking country, Australian as a country that we share a culture, that we share enormous legacy history with. The only other country that really comes to mind is the UK, right? I think the UK and Australia both, right, are in a very unique position to partner with the US as we go forward and reestablish and buffet some of these threats that we've been talked about. I'll tell you on AUKUS as an example, and Amaero is getting more and more involved as we speak in the submarine industrial base. There's enormous need for more industrial-based capabilities in Australia. It's one of the real challenges that we'll have to fulfill the ambitions that we have for AUKUS is we don't have enough industrial capabilities in Australia. So I think it's a lot of opportunity for companies in Australia.
Yeah, right. And then even just going upstream, right, Hank, in terms of minerals and mineral separation refinement too. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I think we might have answered all the questions that have come through today. I'm not sure if you want to have any closing statements, Hank.
No, I would first just like to say thank you. I'm enormously grateful for HR taking this on. And he took this on because of the passion he has for the mission. And the last thing that I would pick up on and close there, and this is where HR is so insightful for me as we have our conversations. As many investors know, I worry about a lot of things, and I'm always thinking about plan Bs and plan Cs. And, HR just mentioned about natural resources in China. This is one of those things that we talk about that heretofore there's been an evolving change of trade relationship. There's been an evolving change of statecraft, as HR would call it. One of the things that HR share as a fear is this could be much more abrupt, and it will be much more abrupt the day it serves China's best interest, period. Right? And so we need to plan for that. And the other thing that I would say that ties in with that is the way that we manage Amaero. This is not a sprint, right? We're trying to solve long-term national security objectives. There's things we've got to accomplish this month, the next 100 days, this quarter, this year. But we're thinking 2 years and 3 years and 4 years and 5 years down the road. I think part of the planning piece of that is there's a lot of our programs that are going through development and demonstration that won't be in production until 27, 28, or maybe even 29. Think about some of the hypersonic program. Think about the Sentinel strategic missile program. There's other programs that we have an immediate need. We haven't really touched on those. And so I think that you'll see adjacency opportunities, adjacency businesses that Amaero will begin to look at. That's a more immediate need. for given the national, the tumultuous, if you will, geopolitical background that we have. So as always, we very much appreciate investors' trust, confidence in us. HR, thank you so much for your time, the energy that you've put into this. And we'll look forward to having more of these conversations with HR in the future.
Hey, thank you, Hank. Thank you so much to all of you. Real privilege to be with you. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Jane. Take care.
Thank you guys. And if we have missed any of your questions, please feel free to reach out by the contact details on the bottom of our ASX announcements. But gentlemen, thanks again for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.